Tonight, we begin with a medical mystery that physicians across 3 states had witnessed, documented, and desperately tried to explain. Demmed a transformation that unfolded not over decades, but in mere years. Banned years that aged a child into an elderly woman before she could reach her 10th birthday. Banned years that turned soft skin into wrinkled parchment. Bland years that bent a young spine into the curve of someone who had lived 8 decades. Months. What happened to Margaret Ellen Thompson in rural Alabama crossed a line that medical science had hoped would never exist. And when that line was crossed, doctors did not look away. They responded with curiosity, with determination, and with an honesty that would haunt them. They had no answers. For 18 months before Margaret's condition became widely known, there had been whispers, not in medical journals, not in hospital records, just whispers, that a family in Limestone County was caring for something unusual. And the Thompsons had been private, yes, but they had been desperate in their privacy. Landed their visits to physicians, followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a ritual. But what set off alarm bells in Mobile and Montgomery that autumn was that the visits went silent. Man-country doctors who monitor families in isolated communities know the indicators. Moose. The sudden cessation of medical consultations, the withdrawal from church services, the refusal of visitors to the home, the sudden construction of heavy curtains over every window, all of that went quiet in the Thompson household. And whenever a frontier family goes quiet about a sick child, it means something is about to get much worse. Gemmed early September, Iten Babai Ushersan, doctor, Josiah Knott of Mobile, detected what he described as physiological acceleration beyond natural law, including skeletal deterioration that had not been observed in any living patient in over 2 centuries of American medicine. Balanced. These are the kinds of cases that physicians only document when they are signaling something very specific. A breakdown in human development, a challenge to medical understanding, or a phenomenon that defied every known principle of anatomy. Vance Knott didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. Biologist. But what he did know was that Margaret Ellen Thompson was aging at twice the rate of normal human development. And when a child's body shifts toward elderly degeneration without explanation, even by conservative medical standards, the entire profession pays attention. Okay? The medical bulletin issued by the Alabama Medical Association, that October was not normal. It was not routine. Manned, it was not symbolic. It was urgent. Manned physicians, after emergency consultation, described Margaret's condition as mu unprecedented in medical literature, moose progressing with alarming rapidity, and perhaps most importantly, terminal with no known intervention. But medical warnings only matter if colleagues respond. Plianch they did. In fact, their response that autumn was among the most coordinated medical observations we've seen in antebellum Southern medicine. Lant, here's what we know. Within 3 weeks of Knott's initial report, 7 physicians traveled to Limestone County. These weren't country doctors making house calls, but these were trained surgeons and medical theorists, specialists who only made such journeys when they were preparing to witness something that would challenge everything they understood about human physiology. That November, Dr. Samuel Cartwright confirmed that Margaret exhibited rapid cellular aging affecting her skeletal system, integumentary system, and cardiovascular function, including arterial hardening that had recently been identified in patients over 70 years old, not in children under 10. Not in children. Menda Margaret's body was deteriorating before physicians could document the progression. They measured bone density loss. They measured skin elasticity collapse. They measured joint calcification that was likely preparing to immobilize her completely. In other words, physicians were documenting the systematic breakdown of a child's body. Blam, the cellular mechanics that would have kept her alive and growing. Maud, this is what made the medical community's response so urgent. Margaret's aging wasn't just unusual, it was accelerating. It represented the kind of phenomenon that could rewrite human understanding of development if it could be explained. And the doctors, understanding that fully, responded with thorough documentation, not with false hope, not with experimental treatments, but with scientific rigor. They didn't attempt bloodletting. They didn't prescribe mercury compounds. The lands, they measured her height against normal growth charts. They documented the progression of her symptoms with unprecedented detail. And here's where the story becomes even more haunting. As medical historians now believe that Margaret's condition was designed by nature to test the limits of human resilience after some unknown genetic catastrophe. Fallen nature wanted to see whether a child's spirit would break under such physical transformation, but instead, the opposite happened. And Margaret didn't withdraw into silence. Mamja. She remained engaged with her family in ways that were so brave, so lucid, that even hardened physicians wept when they left her bedside. Pamian, you don't get a frontier doctor's tears easily, but Margaret did. So, one physician speaking with colleagues under condition of anonymity described Margaret's demeanor as preternatural composure, a way to endure suffering that adults twice her age could not manage. But Margaret proved during those final months that children possess both extraordinary courage and heartbreaking vulnerability. Thus, her questions were not only intelligent, they were perceptive in ways that revealed she understood exactly what was happening to her body. Mlins, that awareness matters because it shows she was not merely a medical curiosity. It shows that Margaret was not a case study to be cataloged and forgotten. She was a child trying to understand why her body was betraying her. Okay? Now, as reports continued coming in throughout the winter of Ichan Babai Wushersan, we learned more about the scale of Margaret's physical deterioration. Her height, which had been normal at age 5, had stopped increasing entirely, forcing her frame to compress under premature spinal curvature. Velndebai's her hair, which had been dark brown, had turned completely white by her 8th birthday, a transformation that had been documented in only the most extreme cases of shock or poisoning. Bemdad her joints, operating under stress no child should endure, reportedly exhibited the limited range of motion used by patients suffering from advanced arthritis. Maligned, this wasn't just premature aging. This wasn't just a growth abnormality. This was systemic collapse. This was the complete failure of developmental regulation. And developmental regulation is the one thing that separates childhood from old age, the biological programming that tells cells when to grow and when to stop. Planned for every day that Margaret aged, her body countered with something that accelerated the next stage of deterioration. Okay? Remember, the medical establishment thought children's diseases were well understood. They thought growth patterns followed predictable trajectories. Pongens, they thought aging was a slow, inevitable process that began in middle age. But in Ichan Babai Wushersan, the exact opposite was happening in a farmhouse in Alabama. Menda Child was aging faster than anyone had documented. Physicians were confronting a phenomenon that had no name, and a family was watching their daughter transform into someone they barely recognized. What makes this moment so devastating and so significant is that Margaret's condition manifested at a time when American medicine was under enormous intellectual pressure. Meant traditional practitioners wanted to maintain classical theories of humoral balance. Progressive physicians wanted to embrace cellular pathology and experimental observation. Mendrite religious communities wanted explanations that aligned with divine providence. And Margaret's family wanted simply to understand why their daughter was being taken from them in such a cruel manner. The Thompsons were balancing these competing explanations while watching their child suffer. And when families in that position seek medical help, they're not doing it from a position of strength. Lands, they're doing it from desperation, they're doing it from love mixed with helplessness. The Alabama Medical Association's bulletin, now distributed to medical societies across the South, was designed to signal that the profession was not willing to ignore unexplained pediatric conditions. Medical officials said plainly that Margaret's aging was inconsistent with all known principles of human development. BANTS, that is medical journal language for, we have no idea what's happening and it terrifies us. Hops, you don't usually hear that tone from medical authorities unless something serious is at stake, unless physicians are admitting the profound limits of their knowledge. Okay? Meanwhile, Margaret's father, Robert Thompson, addressed his church congregation in a brief, anguished statement that winter. Belinja, he said, we have asked the Lord why this burden has been placed upon our child. Manja, he said, we have consulted every physician within 100 miles, and he said, Margaret remains as bright and loving as the day she was born, even as her body fails her. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are words from a father who understands just how helpless he is in the face of his daughter's suffering. Here's what makes the situation even more medically complex. Margaret's aging wasn't limited to external appearance. Malland, along with visible physical changes, collage her cardiovascular system also showed signs of atherosclerosis, typically seen in patients over 60. Her vision deteriorated rapidly, requiring her to stay in dimly lit rooms. Her bone density decreased to levels that made even gentle movement painful. All of this happened within the same 18-month period. When multiple organ systems deteriorate simultaneously in a child, it means something fundamental has gone wrong at the cellular level. Physicians were now considering several possibilities. One was that Margaret was suffering from an unknown inherited disorder affecting cellular replication. Another was that she had been exposed to some environmental toxin that was accelerating metabolic processes. Because a third possibility, the one worrying doctors the most, is that Margaret represented a spontaneous mutation that revealed how fragile human development truly was. But in Ichem Babai Ushersan, physicians lacked the tools to test any of these hypotheses. They didn't have genetic analysis. They didn't have cellular microscopy advanced enough to detect chromosomal abnormalities. They didn't have biochemical assays to measure metabolic dysfunction. They had observation, documentation, and honesty about their limitations. What we're watching in this case is a test of medical humility. Man's physicians wanted to see if they could identify a cause where none was apparent. Found as Margaret's family wanted to see if medicine could offer any comfort, any explanation, any hope. Mats. The medical community wanted to prevent the dismissal of unexplained pediatric conditions as supernatural phenomena. And future generations wanted to prevent other children from suffering without at least the dignity of proper medical documentation. In Margaret's final months, we've learned from medical records that physicians were documenting her decline with unprecedented care. They recorded her weight loss, they recorded her cognitive function, which remained remarkably intact despite her physical deterioration. And they recorded Margaret's own questions about why her hands looked like her grandmother's hands landed. But Margaret was not bitter. In fact, Margaret was described by every physician who examined her as exceptionally kind. Mulda? Her demeanor during examinations, patient, curious, and trusting, sent a message to the medical community that children deserve dignity even when medicine cannot save them. And it sent a message to her family that Margaret understood, perhaps better than the adults around her, that some suffering cannot be explained or prevented. As the winter of Ichenba by Ushasus approached, doctors expected Margaret's condition to reach its inevitable conclusion. But what we do know is that the medical documentation was thorough. It preserved her case for future study, and it established protocols for documenting rare pediatric conditions, and it honored Margaret's suffering by taking it seriously rather than dismissing it as beyond medical concern. What happened to Margaret Thompson in the months after that final examination will depend on what medical historians can recover from fragmentary records. This case will be remembered as one of the earliest documented instances, of progeria or a progeria-like syndrome in American medical literature. If only family records remain, physicians have already shown they were willing to acknowledge the limits of their knowledge. And they have shown they were ready to document what they could not cure. Okay? And by early Ichenba by Ushasus, for the first time in medical history, physicians in Alabama were confronting a truth they had long suspected but never proven. That human development could fail catastrophically, that childhood and old age could collide in a single body. And that even the most skilled physicians were helpless before certain biological mysteries. The medical journals went quiet after Margaret's case, too quiet. And when the medical establishment is quiet about a case as significant, it means they are grappling with implications. It means they are choosing their next theoretical frameworks carefully. Because Margaret's case taught physicians something they would document in hushed tones for decades afterward. That the human body contains mysteries that exceed our capacity to explain. Believes that suffering can be documented even when it cannot be prevented. And that a child's courage in the face of inexplicable illness can teach doctors more about human resilience than any textbook ever could. The story is heartbreaking, valiant, but Margaret's case is also historically significant. It represents one of the earliest American attempts to document rapid aging in children. It reveals the limitations of mid-13th century medicine with painful honesty. And it preserves the memory of a girl whose body aged twice as fast as it should have, a girl whose name might otherwise have been lost to history. And we remember her now not just as a medical curiosity, but as Margaret Ellen Thompson, a child who faced the unimaginable with more grace than most adults could summon